To go further into the concept of blocks, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to explode one block so that you can see, again, the reason why we use blocks. So for this, I'm going to use the explode command, and you can either type in explode or hit X and enter. And what we saw from the last video is that if we change one of these, they all change as long as they're blocks of the same name. If I create my block, and by default it has the option to be exploded, you can see that if I type in explode or X and hit enter, and the explode tool is also up in the modify, what it does is it actually returns the block to the original objects. Okay, so theoretically and technically it's no longer a block. So that if I double click on my chair and change it, and again I'm going to go to the home and I'm going to use my tools to make, turn my ortho off, and modify my block. And then close it and save the changes. You'll see that anything else that is defined as that block and is from that original block is changed except for the one that exploded, okay, because technically this is no longer a block. Now, another thing that people do with blocks is that in addition to making their blocks, what they do is they try to save a library of blocks. And it's a good common practice to have, because a lot of times what happens is that you work with the same program over and over and over again, and it's very helpful to have the same blocks so that you don't have to draw them over and over and over again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to create what essentially is called a write block, okay? And what a write block is all it's doing is it's writing the original objects to a file, okay, that's outside of AutoCAD so that you can actually insert it later as a block. Now, it's not really the way that we create blocks. Okay, really what it's doing is it's just saving this information to a separate DWG file, okay? And what we don't want to do is we don't want to create a write block from a block that's already made, because what happens is that when you do create the file from a block, you're going to have to explode it, okay, into its original objects in order to be a write block file, okay? And again, the write block file is no different than any other DWG file. All it's doing is taking a bit of information and saving it as a DWG file, its own DWG file elsewhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in wblock for write block. And what it's going to do is it's going to bring up some options that do look similar to the block editor that we opened before. And what I want to do is, first of all, I want to select my base point. So I'm going to, usually with a circular object, I always pick a center as a base point. And then I'm going to select my objects and hit enter. And then down at the bottom, what it's doing is it's asking me to save it in a destination folder. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to name it something that I'm going to easily recognize it by. Now, with the default, it's always going to name everything new block, so you want to make sure that you give it a name that you can always, be able to find it easily afterwards. So I'm going to click on the Browse button, and I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name it ACAD 2D blocks. You can also make three-dimensional blocks, and we'll get into that when we start to work with three-dimensional AutoCAD. And I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to name it circular chair. Okay, hit save. It's going to bounce me back into here, so I'm going to say OK. A little window is going to pop up really quickly, and you'll see that it didn't actually make a block out of these objects. Okay, so in a way, write block doesn't make any blocks. What it does is it just writes this information to another file outside. So what I want to do now is I want to actually insert this as a block. So I'm going to type in insert. And now rather than finding a block that's already in my file, if I go to browse and if I go to my desktop and if I find my AutoCAD 2D blocks, you'll see that my circular chair is there. And I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to insert it, and now it inserts as a block. So essentially, that's the MO behind the write block, is that it actually inserts objects as a block from an external file. So you don't have to start off by drawing it in the file. You can actually save it elsewhere. So I can have a furniture drawing elsewhere, and I can bring it in as a block. And if it changes, and then I insert it again, it'll ask me if I want to redefine the block with the updates that were changed after we changed the right block file. And it'll always update it like it does with the W block, but you have to insert it again after you make those changes in order to update all those blocks. Now you'll find that with blocks there are a lot of resources online for you to use them, and also AutoCAD has its own what's called its design center, and that also contains a lot of blocks for you. So if you do Control-2, what opens up is AutoCAD's design center, and if you go down to the options that they have under AutoCAD 2014, if you go down to Sample and ENUS and you see Design Centers and Dynamic Blocks, you can open up those files and they'll have groups of blocks for you. So you'll see that there's a list of these blocks, and essentially these are groupings of blocks. You can see that there's home planners, there's house designers, there's kitchens. There's also some blocks for HVAC and some landscape blocks and electrical blocks. What we want to do is we can either click and drag one of these in, but I think it's easier because it comes in as a larger block that you have to explode in order to get the smaller blocks. I think it's just easier to double click on that. And if you click on blocks, what it does is it has these individual blocks that are in the design center. So for example, if I want to add a sink, okay, I am going to find the sink, double sink right here, or there's a single sink, and I'm going to click on that block and I'm going to drag it into my file. And you'll notice that these ones are properly set up. The original objects are in layer 0, okay, so that I can take this block and I can put it on the fixtures layer, okay, because fixtures are plumbing fixtures, and I can add them to where I want them to be. Now this is just a singular sink, you have to add like the countertop around it, but keep in mind AutoCAD's blocks tend to look a little clunky. So for this assignment, what I'm having you do is make your own blocks. But if you want to find blocks that look better, there are a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of vendors out there that create their own blocks that look much better. So for example, with ovens, you might look to wolf.com or Wolf Sub-Zero, which they also have blocks for refrigerators. A lot of these manufacturers do actually use and do create 2D and 3D blocks for you to use. Now the other thing that I want to show you is I'm going to close out my design center. I'm just going to get rid of that sink and this chair that's distracting. But what else I want to show you is how to add hatches in your file. So basically, to add hatches, there is the hatch command, which is H or hatch, okay, and it's also under here. And what this does is it brings you to this hatch dialog that opens up above with the command. And essentially there's the first part, which is how do you actually want to define your hatch. And now by default, okay, you'll see that if I mouse over an area, as long as it's bounded by objects, okay, lines could be overlapping, but as long as there's a closed boundary that's created, I can pick within that and have it fill in essentially this internal space. Just keep in mind that this is where AutoCAD starts to crash a lot, is that when you use this pick points. Okay, it's really great. It seems like the greatest thing in the world, that it's really easy and it's really quick. But a lot of times what happens is you have to dumb down what AutoCAD's looking for in order to add hatches. So you'll see the other selection is to click on select. And what that does is it allows you to select either a polyline or a bounded area or a series of objects, a series of lines, and it'll figure out the interior spot. So this essentially, so if I hit enter, okay, this is essentially a hatch that I just selected by this is the default hatch that I clicked and I inserted into my, this is going to be a pool area. So if I click on it, okay, this I can either, define the properties afterwards, okay, or I can set it and then click on it and I can work with the properties after. So you can either do, you can define those properties first, or you can do them after. If you look under pattern, okay, you'll see that AutoCAD has a lot of patterns. And then one thing that you have to figure out is that, you know, there is a language behind patterns in AutoCAD, so you'll learn that as you go, especially in the profession. You know, for example, this concrete, the AR concrete, is really if you're cutting through a concrete detail, like a footing detail. Typically, if I have concrete, I might use the sand hatch. Okay, if I have a pool like this, I might use, you know, just a regular ANSI hatch. Okay, or I'll use a sand hatch. But I'm going to keep it with the sand hatch for now. You'll see that there's a lot of others that you can start to work with. And typically what I do is, you know, I don't really use the transparencies in any of these options, just because I think they tend to get a little bit tricky. Okay, and if they're not set up okay and somebody else is using your computer, it can, you know, get a little bit confusing. So for now, you know, I would stay away from that. There is in the handout there explanations of why I'm not a big fan of the, you know, the transparency and the other options that AutoCAD has for the hatches. You know, they really developed them a lot, but, you know, it has its, you know, its pluses and its minuses. So I just use it the regular way. And what I do is I set up my hatch. I set up the, you know, again, I stay away from transparency. The angle, you can change the angle of it, okay? And this is just a slider, and you'll see that when you do change the angle, it should rotate. Okay, you'll see mine's rotating a bit. And then this is the scale of it. So basically what you have to do is you have to kind of test out what scale hatches are going to, you know, show up as. And again, this is going to be graphically. When we start to print out, you'll see how it looks, and you'll adjust it as you need to according to, you know, the PDFs that you print out. And so some of the hatches, you know, you make them smaller in order to get, you know, less dense. Okay, some you go bigger like this hatch to make less dense. So it really just depends on the hatch. Set origin, what you can do is you can actually click on this and set the point where you want the hatch to start, okay, which is very helpful for bricks. Associative, that basically means that if I take this boundary, it'll stretch with it. So that's always a good option to have for AutoCAD. It just kind of saves a step if you're ever changing anything. Okay, I just undid that. And then, you know, you can match properties of hatches. You can use it here, or you can use the match properties that's basically over in your clipboard that we talked about a few weeks ago. You can type in MA or match prop. And that's really what hatches, you know, that's, you know, that's really kind of the gist of hatches. If you have, you know, for example, if I have something in the middle, you know, like a, I don't know, some sort of an island, I guess, feature in my pool. Okay, I can click on the hatch and I can select that object too as well to kind of give the indicator to AutoCAD to ignore that island. Okay, and if I want, you know, and if I have, you know, boundaries in here that I want to remove, you can always use those options there too as well. But those are the options to help define, you know, the area that you want to hatch. And then this should be on a pattern layer or one of your lightest line weights. Okay, so I'm going to put this on my A-plan pat layer because I know that this gray is one of my lighter line weights. And then a couple things is that I think are really, really helpful is that when we talked about the draw order before, a lot of times hatches will be on a screened layer, okay, and they'll pop up in front of your black lines. So there's a really, really great command that AutoCAD put, it introduced into the program, which is called hatch to back. And what it does is it's essentially a draw order for the hatches. And 90% of the time, the issues that you have with draw order is going to be with hatches. So if you click on hatch to back, what it does is it essentially throws all the hatches from model space. You have to be in model space. You can't be in paper space or in a viewport. Okay, you have to go into model space. You have to do a hatch to back, and it'll send all of your hatches to the back so that they're not going to be on top of your black lines. One other thing that I want to note is that I can theoretically, yes, explode my hatches too, okay, into singular lines. However, this is a very, 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 very bad habit. So whatever you do, okay, do not explode your hatches. There are ways of creating custom hatches. We're not going to get into that, but they're pretty easy to do. But you should never, ever, ever explode your hatches, period.